Welcome back to Vote and Voice, and today we're going to talk about another ideology, and that's environmentalism. So, environmentalism is one of those ideas that shows up in a lot of different places, but it doesn't always mean just one thing, as, you know, it, at its core, it really refers to a broad movement that is centered on how humans relate to, the natural environment, the world, and how societies manage those resources, ecosystems, and environmental damage. It includes science, politics, activism, education, and even cultural and religious beliefs. And depending on who you talk to, environmentalism is like a movement about conservation, or justice, or technology, or survival, when in reality it has always been all of those things at once. So one way to understand environmentalism is to think about it as a response to, human impact, as human societies have always interacted with nature, and the intensity of that relationship has changed over time. Early forms of environmental thinking weren't called environmentalism, as it's a much more new term, but they still exist in different cultural and religious traditions. As in ancient India, Jain philosophy emphasized nonviolence toward living beings, which extended into a broader respect for life and ecosystems. In parts of West Asia, early leaders gave instructions that discouraged unnecessary destructions of trees or, animals during conflict, which shows that even in early military and political context, there was some sort of law of war, some sort of awareness of environmental limits. So in medieval Europe, religious figures also expressed ideas that connected spirituality with the natural world, as Francis of Assisi, for example, described nature in deeply respectful and almost relational terms, framing the environment as something humans are part of rather than a separate form. And at the same time, in different parts of the world, early rulers and communities began noticing the effects of resource use, whether that was deforestation, pollution, or scarcity of materials. So as societies moved into the early modern period, concerns about environmental damage become more noticeable, especially in growing cities. Even in places like London, there were early attempts to regulate pollution, like restrictions on burning certain types of fuel due to air quality concerns. And these actions were not a part of a unified movement, but they show that environmental issues often become visible when human activity starts to overwhelm local ecosystems. And the real turning point comes with the Industrial Revolution. This is where environmentalism begins to take shape in a much more recognizable form. And industrialization massively increased production, urbanization, and energy consumption, especially through coal and later oil. And cities have became heavily polluted. Rivers were contaminated and air quality declined in ways that affected public health and daily life. For the first time, environmental damage was not isolated or local in a minor sense, but widespread and tied directly to economic systems. By the 19th century, responses to these changes started to form much more structural ideas about conservation. Thinkers like Henry David John Muir in the United States emphasized the importance of nature as not just a resource, but something as meaningful in itself. And this led to early conservation efforts, national parks, and legal protections for natural spaces. At the same time, wildlife protection laws and early environmental organizations began to appear in different countries, often focusing on preserving specific landscapes or species. But even then, environmentalism, it was already splitting into different directions, as some people focus on the preservation, meaning protecting nature from human use, and others focus on the conservation, managing resources in a controlled way so they could be used much more sustainable. And those two ideas sometimes overlapped, but they also created long-standing differences in how environmental policy developed. So the 20th century expanded this even further, and environmentalism became tied to global events, scientific discoveries, and political movements. And after, the first two wars, industrial growth accelerated again, but so did awareness of environmental damage, nuclear testing, oil spills, and industrial disasters. Since, the mid 40s, it has become more visible to the public. At the same time, scientific researchers began connecting human activity to long-term ecological risks. And books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring played a major role in changing public awareness by showing how chemicals like pesticides could affect ecosystems in ways that weren't immediately visible. So around the same time, concerns about pollution, resource limits, and industrial expansion led to reports and studies that question whether economic growth could continue indefinitely without environmental consequences. So this period saw the creation of major environmental institutions and agencies, along with global conferences that brought environmental issues into geopolitics. So by the late 20th century, environmentalism had become a global movement, as we see it way more today in the 21st century. So organizations form across countries, from grassroots activist groups to international NGOs, and political movements also emerged. And at the same time, environmental activism expanded into developing countries, focusing on deforestation, land use, and protection of local communities, or even vulnerable ones to environmental damage. Environmental justice. Environmental justice especially highlighted that environmental harm is not evenly distributed. Some communities, often lower income or minority populations, are more likely to live near pollution resources or industrial waste sites as they see it. And this created debates within environmentalism itself about, fairness, economics, and who benefits or suffers from environmental policy. Moving into the 21st century, environmentalism becomes even more global and interconnected. Climate change becomes one of the central issues, shaping political debates, scientific research, and public activism. International organizations like the United Nations Environmental Programme and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change play major roles in coordinating global responses and research. And environmental concerns have begun to expand to include plastic pollution, biodiversity loss, energy transition, and the impact of technology. So public awareness also includes, this increases through media, documentaries, and global activism movements. Climate strikes led by younger generations bring environmental issues into mainstream conservation and brings into green politics, and that is more visible and continuous than earlier decades, but something that appears in culture, education, and everyday life. At the same time, environmentalism continues to evolve in different directions. So you have themes of environmentalism. So there's one such as bright green environmentalism that emphasizes technology and innovation as solutions. And then you have free market environmentalism that focuses on economic systems and property rights. And then you have labor environmentalism that connects environmental policy to workers' rights and economic transitions. And you have radical environmentalism that takes a more direct action approach, sometimes challenging mainstream institutions. And religious environmental efforts interpret environmental responsibility through spiritual beliefs. And these different perspectives show that environmentalism is not a single unified system, but a collection of overlapping approaches that sometimes agree and sometimes conflict. So yes, environmental organizations, they also vary widely. Some work through legal systems and policy advocacy, and others focus on public education, conservation, or direct action. Some are large international groups, while some others are more small community, region-based initiatives. And this diversity reflects the scale of environmental issues themselves, which range from local pollution problems to global climate systems. So alongside this, environmentalism has actually also faced criticism. So some critics argue that early environmental movements were shaped more by privileged groups and did not always account for the concerns of, minority communities. And others point out the environmental policies can sometimes have unintended economic consequences, or more like environmental racism, which is, like the minority group. or shift environmental burdens from one place to another rather than solving them. So these critiques have led to internal reflection within environmentalism, especially around issues of equity and justice. There is also ongoing debate about how environmentalism should approach science and policy, and some argue for strict limits on human impact on nature, while others emphasize technological solutions and managed development. These differences shaped everything from climate policy to conservation strategies. Despite all these disagreements, environmentalism has consistently produced influential figures across science, politics, activism, art, and culture. From scientists studying ecosystems to activists organizing movements to political leaders shaping policy to writers and artists raising awareness, environmentalism has been carried forward by a wide range of individuals with different motivations and methods. It has also become deeply embedded in popular culture, appearing in films, music, education, and public campaigns. Environmental messages are now part of mainstream global discussion. So when you look at environmentalism as a whole, what stands out is that it's a long process of societies that tries to understand their relationship with the natural world under changing conditions. As economies expand, technologies evolve, and populations grow, environmentalism has many questions that keep reappearing in new forms. And that is what keeps environmentalism active and is constantly shifting rather than static. And even today, it continues to sit at the center of major global conversations about the future, not just in terms of nature itself, but in terms of how societies choose to organize themselves, what risks they accept, and what kind of future they want to build. So that's what environmentalism was all about. Hope you enjoyed the video, and next time, talk more about nationalism. Thank you.